Hello and welcome to the Broken Sword. Today we are looking at the powers and the abilities of the Nazgul.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
The Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, the Nine, the Black Riders. These are Sauron's most terrible servants during his time in Middle-earth. Recently in my video of the full story of the Nazgul, I asked all of you if you wanted a video covering their powers and abilities, and you came back with a resounding yes, so here it is. The Nazgul are largely shrouded in great mystery, but what we do know is that they were once kings of men who had received rings of power from Sauron as gifts after he had taken them from the safes of Eregion when he invaded the land. Over time these men became corrupted until eventually forming into these wraith-like beings that have come to be the source of so many nightmares. But a question with these beings are, just what kind of powers and abilities do they possess? What makes them so great in a terrible way? Well, let's dive into it. Men proved easier to ensnare. Those who used the Nine Rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned into their undoing. They had, as it seemed, an ending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron, and one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore and under the domination of the One, which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. The Nazgul were they, the Ringwraiths, the enemy's most terrible servants. Darkness went with them, and they cried with the voices of death. That passage to start today has come from the Silmarillion, and I feel that is a great place to start when looking at the Nazgul. But where should we go from here? Well, I think we should start off with having a look at their appearance. After all, these once kings of men have been turned into wraiths, so can only be truly seen when in the wraith world. Just like Frodo witnesses upon Weathertop when he puts on the One Ring. So you may wonder, how are they given a form in the general seeing world then? Well, as we see from the movie adaptations through the use of black cloaks, but within the writings they also possess shirts of silver mail. Therefore, they can appear defeated in a moment like when they are washed away while chasing Frodo from Weathertop. But what really happens is their physical embodiment gets taken away, which is not stopping their original form, the one unseeable to most. Then if we look at their eyes, they are said to be hypnotic when looking into, and they could be clearly seen from within their dark clothing. Also, once in the Wraith world, it is said Frodo sees their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. It gives me the impression as they came across as both dead and full of evil at the same time. You may think here as well, if they are clothed, does that mean they can be physically overpowered? Well, it is said that mortal men could not lay their hands on these beings without getting burnt and suffering extreme pain as a result. An example of this kind of effect can be seen by Merry's after effects from his role in bringing down the Witch King. Even after he is healed by Aragorn in the Houses of Healing, it still takes time for a proper recovery, which is why he could not ride with the others to the Battle of the Morannon in the books. And also in relation to this, there were certain examples of enchanted items that made this possible, such as the Barrow blade that was gathered during the Hobbit's time in the Barrow Downs and then used on the Witch King by Merry during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, as mentioned moments ago. Now, talking about weapons, what about the weapons that they wielded? Well, the Ringwraiths had many weapons which included long swords of steel and flame, daggers with venomous properties, poisonous darts, and black maces of great strength. Of these physical weapons, the most well-known one is the MORGUL knife, also known as the MORGUL blade. This is of course the one that the Witch King uses to stab Frodo upon Weathertop. It was a magical poison dagger that does something to the person it stabbed much worse than killing them. As we witness from Frodo's stabbing, a fragment of the blade is intended to break off in the sufferer and remain within the wound, slowly turning them into a wraith that will be bent to the will of the Witch King. It can only be healed by a powerful healer, and then only if they can remove all fragments of the blade that may remain. We see the effects get slowed by the use of Kingsfoil or Athelas, a herb that possesses healing properties, but all this will do is slow the effects, not prevent or heal them. Even after being healed from this wound, the victim will suffer effects for the rest of their life. Using Frodo as the example again, he fell ill on the day of his stabbing every year for the rest of his time in Middle-earth, until he left to travel west, where finally the pain was no more. One last thing to mention about the Morgul blade that is actually quite interesting is that how Frodo saw it glow a pale white when seeing the Nazgul in the Wraith world after putting on the One Ring, showing that there are some links there to its powers. Desperate, he drew his own sword, and it seemed to him that it flickered red as if it was a firebrand. Two of the figures halted. The third was taller than the others, his hair was long and gleaming, and on his helm was a crown. In one hand he held a long sword, and in the other a knife. Both the knife and the hand that held it glowed with a pale light. He sprang forward and bore down on Frodo. So, now moving on. When we look at the weapons of the Nazgul, we cannot just look at the physical items. They also possess seemingly magical weapons of devastating power. One of their most used and feared is the Aura of Terror. This chief weapon of theirs affects all living creatures. It is as though they are surrounded by an energy that just saps up an enemy's morale. Although this does affect all living creatures, it is said that any being who has spent time in the Blessed Realm under the light of the two trees was immune to this fear. This includes the likes of the ISTARI, Galadriel, and Celeborn. They also have an ability known as the Black Breath or Black Shadow. This ability gave the Nazgul the power to cause disorientation and illness, or even worse through prolonged exposure. The time we witness this is from the encounter in Bree between the Nazgul, who are hunting Frodo at the time, and Meriadoc Brandybuck. Merry unfortunately becomes exposed to two of the Nazgul at Bree while taking a walk, but luckily for him his encounter was brief, so he only fell into a trance-like sleep that was troubled by nightmares as opposed to something potentially far worse. In fact, Merry would be unlucky to suffer from this for a second time, along with Faramir and Eowyn during the siege of Minas Tirith. This time they could only be properly healed by King Elisar in the Houses of Healing, after it's not something at this point that they could have just slept off. As mentioned before, this along with the effects of having stabbed the Witch King led to him needing to recover rather than join the others who marched on the Black Gates. Another part of their fear tactics was through the use of their cry as well. This too caused terror and despair in all those that heard it. Out of the wreck rose the Black Rider, tall and threatening, towering over her. With a cry of hatred that stung the very ears like venom, he let fall his mace. Her shield was shivered in many pieces, and her arm was broken. She stumbled to her knees. He bent over her like a cloud, and his eyes glittered. He raised his mace to kill. In the movies, it is shown that all of the Nazgul possess the power of this cry, but it is uncertain whether they all actually did, or this was just one solely belonging to the Witch King, as the Witch King is the only one to do anything with this power in the writings. Albeit, even if it was a Peter Jackson edition, the cry from the films is just an iconic noise. It is probably no surprise at all either that the Nazgul possess a certain ability as sorcerers, and they use this magic to devastating effect. A great example of this is when the forces of Mordor are trying to break the gates at Minas Tirith. Initially the gates are able to withstand the blows of Grond, the great battering ram. That is, until the Witch King arrives. The drums rolled and rattled. With a vast rush, Grond was hurled forwards by huge hands. It reached the gate. It swung. A deep boom rumbled through the city like thunder running into the clouds, but the doors of iron and posts of steel withstood the stroke. Then the Black Captain rose in his stirrups and cried aloud in a dreadful voice, speaking in some forgotten tongue words of power and terror to rend both heart and soul. Thrice he cried. Thrice the great ram boomed, and suddenly upon the last stroke the gate of Gondor broke. As if stricken by some blasting spell, it burst asunder. There was a flash of searing lightning, and the doors tumbled in riven fragments to the ground. The ability of sorcery is one that can possibly bring other abilities under its umbrella, like that of the Black Breath we have already talked about, and potentially even this next one too, as the Witch King could also affect the weather. The record of this ability comes from how the snowmen of FRODO'S feared him, for he could make frost or thaw at his will. It is also said that he conjured up the great blinding snow out of the north that sank the Telerin ships that Círdan had sent to rescue King Arvedui in 1975 of the Third Age, which, as a bonus fact, is also the moment when 2 of the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones, were lost to the water. And again, another example of their sorcery, or more specifically the Witch King's again, even if you did not realise it was him behind it, and that is the raising of the Lesser Wraiths, also known as the Barrow Wights. The Witch King had sent these evil spirits out of Angmar and Rhudaur to dwell in those tombs as a sign of disrespect to those who lay there, and these would be the same ones that the hobbits run into in the Fellowship of the Ring, with them then being saved by the one and only Tom Bombadil. And of course, if you'd like to know any more about the mysterious being known as Tom Bombadil, we do have a video on that, so please go and check that out. But anyway, as mentioned before, the Nazgul existed mostly in the Wraith world, which in turn makes them extremely difficult to harm. Your standard weapon could not hurt them. Even the weapons of the Númenóreans would not be enough and be destroyed if they passed through the Wraith forms of the Nazgul. Although this made them formidable, it did also hinder them, for they could not interact normally with the seen world. To be able to do this, they needed the help in the way of clothing and weapons that were provided by Sauron to give them form. So, in a sense, they could be defeated by attacks that destroyed their robes, like we see at the Ford of Bruinen, forcing them to return to Sauron to receive new ones, but this does not actually damage them as a being. It is more of an inconvenience than anything. One thing about this though that I am going to be perfectly honest, I am a little bit unclear of, and perhaps there's someone out there who knows the answer to it, is I cannot tell if Sauron is the only one who can give them items that they could wear and use, in the same way that Sauron is the one who could give them horses that were able to withstand them because of their terror. So is it possible they could have just picked up any man's robes and used them, or did they have to return all the way to Mordor to be able to be re-robed? Perhaps they could have picked up any sword to use it, or would it have just been destroyed in their hand like those that would have struck them? I'm not too sure, but if they could, it could make for an interesting look. I'd be curious to know what you think about this in the comment section below though. So that is kind of the more specific powers and abilities, but there are a few more points to address yet. We will look at a quick couple of things that go against them before we then move on to what their potential could truly be. This one now then is obviously more of a weakness than an ability, but I do feel it is something worth mentioning, and that is the daylight weakens them. Being servants of evil, servants of darkness, that is where they thrive. They want to be working from the shadows where they can hide and manipulate things, not out in the open for anyone to witness. Something that is interesting with this though is how each of the Nazgul can be affected differently by it, as it says in the Unfinished Tales book that of Khamûl it is said here that he was the most ready of all the Nazgul, after the Black Captain himself, to perceive the presence of the ring, but also the one whose power was most confused and diminished by daylight. So although Khamûl was known as being second in command, he was the bottom of the ladder in terms of how the sunlight affected him. It is never specified why this may have been, so maybe you guys have some interesting theories on this that you could let me know in the comment section below too. I would be really curious to see. And then another thing with the Nazgul is that a lot of people assume they are these extremely powerful, unbeatable beings. And while in darkness, under the hand of Sauron, that is not too far from the truth. In more common circumstances, they are actually perhaps a bit weaker than you may have believed. Tolkien even addresses in one of his letters how they have no great physical power against the fearless, but what they have, and the fear that they inspire, is enormously increased in darkness. Meaning, this emphasizes how so much of their powers comes from the fear people have of them. If someone is willing to stand up to them, to not be scared, the Nazgul lose so much of what they are. They say that if the 9 Nazgul were together, then not even Glorfindel and Aragorn could have stopped them. Yet Aragorn also scares 5 of them away upon Weathertop. Now yes, the Nazgul weren't exactly trying to fight hard at this point, but when Aragorn shows no fear towards them, they do think twice about standing with him, choosing instead to retreat and wait for Frodo's Morgul blade wound to transform him into a wraith instead. It is quite interesting how the idea of fear being someone's greatest enemy really comes across in the concept of the Nazgul. So with their weaknesses covered, let us think about their true potential. The Nazgul's power are very much linked to the power of Sauron at that time. It is said how we see them in The Lord of the Rings that this is just a fraction of the kind of power that they would possess if Sauron managed to regain the One Ring. We only need to look what Tolkien says in letter 210 with how the Witch King is put in command by Sauron, he is given an added demonic force. And this greatly increases the power and threat of him. Now just imagine he took this same idea with all 9 of the Nazgul and the additional power he could give them when he possessed the true power of the One Ring. It is almost unimaginable. How could anyone truly come up against this? So with that thought, we will begin to round this up. What would you say is the main power or ability of the Nazgul? Well, to me, it must come down to the fear that they impose upon their enemies, sapping their strength of will until they break down. Along with this too, the fact that they are in a sense immortal. They are cursed to keep living an unending living death. They are stuck as wraiths, not people. Although their physical clothes can be destroyed, they can simply just return to Sauron to receive new ones and go back out into Middle-earth again as the Dark Lord's slaves. You can see just why these beings are known as Sauron's most terrible servants. After all, it is not like they can ever fight against him. They do not even wear the rings that turn them into these wraiths. Sauron took them off the Nazgul long ago. They are trapped into serving his will for as long as Sauron survives, for only when he dies will their curse truly be broken. That is, unless you have some kind of special barrow blade from years before happening to turn up at just the right time. So, I hope you all enjoyed this video for today, and this now leads me onto my question of the day for you all, and that is, what is your favourite fan theory for the backgrounds of one of the Nazgul? Do you see them as already great kings when they received the rings? Do you see them as a lowly warrior who grew to power because of the ring? Where do you see them coming from? I'd love to know all of your thoughts and theories in the comment section below. And now quickly to mention our other channels here, links of course will be in the description below if you'd like to check any of them out, and also to shout out our patrons. Firstly, we have our Divine Power tier members of Kevin, Abram and Matt. You are all awesome. A big thank you to our Fire Demon tier members of Nashith, Denversteel and Gregory. You are amazing. And as well, I cannot forget the Wizard Staff tier members of John, Andrew and Finrod Felagund. Every single one of you is a true legend of the Brohirrim. And finally, if you have managed to reach the very end of this video with me today, all I ask is why not hit that like button and the subscribe button too if you have enjoyed it, because then you can be notified of all of our future uploads. So thank you if you have managed to reach the very end of this video with me today, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.